Welcome to our podcast about leisure, work and well-being. In this podcast, we explore what we can learn from our experiences of engaging with leisure seriously and from the vast literature on the topic of serious leisure. My name is Petya Petrova, Associate Director of Academic Practice. I am based at the University of the West of England in Bristol. We often refer to our university here as UWE. I am your host for today's podcast. Before I introduce our guests today and the fascinating stories we have to hear, I just need to alert you that during this recording, my computer was infected by voice gremlins, which means that there is a little bit of a hissing noise every time I ask a question. Fortunately, most of what you hear next are the fabulously narrated stories and experiences by our guests, and these are clear in both the explanation but also in sound quality. So hopefully the little sound distortions in my questions will not affect your listening and your enjoyment of this podcast. I'm joined by our regular podcast contributors, Kat Branch, who is the leader of the UWE Centre for Music. Welcome, Kat.
Lovely to see you today.
And of course, we are joined by Dr. Sam Elkington from Teesside University. Sam is our resident podcast expert on the topic of serious leisure, and he's also the co-author of the Serious Leisure Perspective book. Welcome, Sam.
Afternoon all, it's a pleasure to be here.
We are very excited today to welcome our two guests who are bringing quite a unique and interesting perspective to our podcast series, something we haven't talked about before. We are joined by Amanda Headley-White. Amanda is a student caseworker at our Student and Academic Services. Welcome, Amanda.
Hi, thank you very much for having me on.
We are also joined by Dr. Alison Miles. Alison is Senior Lecturer in Organisation Studies at the Faculty of Business and Law. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you very much, and hello, everybody.
As usual, we are going to start with the professional roles and backgrounds of our two guests, because these often provide quite an interesting setting for what we're about to discuss. So, Amanda, would you tell us a little bit about your professional role, please?
Yeah, so my professional role, well, I've been at UWE for about 4 years. Previously to that, I worked in the mental health sector, and then I decided to make a complete change and work in university sectors. I currently work in the student casework team, and we deal with complaints, conduct, fitness to study, professional suitability, and academic appeals. So kind of all the things that we wish didn't happen in a way. But I find it a really interesting job. It's sort of different every day. And there's a lot of problem solving. So a lot of it's about how we keep students at university, how we enable them to carry on studying, how we resolve complaints. So whilst it's sort of the dark corners of the university in a way, it's also really interesting and very satisfying. So yeah, I enjoy it.
Thank you, Amanda. I think that might be a topic of another podcast, just discussing your job and what actually that involves. And it is great that it also involves a lot of work on how we support students to stay on and succeed. We are also joined by Alison. So, Alison, would you tell us about your professional role and background, please?
So, as you said in your introduction, I'm a senior lecturer here in the Organisational Studies cluster. So I spend most of my time looking at issues around leadership, change and entrepreneurship. And obviously the change bit at the moment is very topical. We can't get away from change even if we want to. And so I work predominantly with students all levels, so first year, second year, third year and master's students, but I'm also having a lot of fun at the moment with a couple of projects with the Federation of Small Businesses actually, and small businesses around the southwest, which is really interesting. It's a very different perspective than the student one. So that's what takes up most of my work time. I've been at UWE for 2.5 years, although I seem to have missed the last year like the rest of us, I think. Prior to that, I was at Plymouth University for 6 years. Did lots of things before that, but I won't go there, otherwise we'll take up the entire podcast.
Thank you, Alison. And as usual, there's so many questions I already have about all your interesting work. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about your leisure pursuits. We often named the leisure pursuit before we start at this point, and we had a conversation about what to name our discussion and our theme today. And our theme is, we decided to name it, for the moment, spending time with animals. So, as I said, quite an interesting tack to all our previous episodes for those of you who have listened to these episodes to date. And I would like to start with Amanda, because Amanda kindly volunteered to take part in this podcast. We have been sending invitation wide across the UWE communication channels for colleagues to step forward and come and talk to us about their serious leisure pursuits. And Amanda very kindly reached out to us and said, I'm actually doing something at the moment I'd quite like to discuss and unpack. And I listened to your podcast and I thought that would be an interesting setting to talk about what I'm currently experiencing. And we're very grateful, Amanda, for you doing so. So I would just invite you to tell us a little bit about your story. How did it begin, and why you thought this conversation was useful, would be of interest to you, I seem to be keeping this secret. I'm not saying what the story is, but the story is basically Amanda has a horse she looks after, and that she spends a fair bit of time with and for. So Amanda, just can you tell us a little bit about your story, please?
Yeah, so just to come on to, I guess, starting with why I volunteered to be on the podcast, I think I saw it on Yammer or something and thought, yeah, serious leisure, what's that? And then when I read about it, I thought, well, I don't know how much money because I don't add it up on my horse. And I think I calculated probably around 30 hours a week at the moment. And I kind of thought that's quite a serious leisure pursuit compared to the kind of pursuits a lot of my friends have. And that doesn't include all the time I spend thinking about it. So I think I've got one of those brains which just has a horse in the middle. There's nothing else in there most of the time. So as a child, I always loved animals. I grew up on a small holding till I was 5. And then at some fateful point, I went pony trekking, and I think, like a lot of little girls, just became obsessed with horses and ponies, and insisted that I should have horse riding lessons. I was meant to have piano lessons at the time, and I worked out that a horse riding lesson every fortnight was the same cost as a piano lesson every week. Sorry, Kat's probably really horrified because she works in the centre of music at my pianist career that was lost at that point. So although we didn't really have much money growing up, I rode at weekends, and I think I just spent all my mental energy and emotional energy around horses. I drew horses, I read about horses, I thought about horses, I dreamt about horses, I pretended I was riding horses, I pretended I was a horse, and that was my sort of childhood, was largely populated by horses. I always wanted my own horse. I think other children dreamt of having boyfriends or families or jobs or stuff, and I just wanted a horse. And then life got in the way. I went away to boarding school. I had some health problems. So horses kind of took a real backseat for quite a long time. Certainly like the reality of a horse and the physicality of one did. I still thought about them. And then I decided to start riding again, I think about 7 years ago. And I can only describe it like someone taking a drug where you go and do something and it's like, I have to do this now. I have to get a fix every week. I have to get this every twice a week. And then suddenly just riding someone else's horse isn't good enough. I need to share a horse. I need to have a horse. So I ended up sharing a pony with someone at the stables, and then ended up buying a horse when I took redundancy from my previous job, with my redundancy money. And then when that horse, Cassie, retired just before the first lockdown, and I sold her back to her old owner with the full plan that I wouldn't buy another horse till things were a bit more like clear was what going to happen with COVID, and that buying a horse mid-pandemic was a really, really bad idea. And 2 hours after I sold her, I bought Blossom, the next horse, which I'd been planning on buying her from the owners of the stables where I ride. So it wasn't just that I went and saw a random horse in a field and said, here's however many £1,000. It was a bit more planned than that, but it was slightly quicker than I'd planned. And I think a lot of what I've thought about the whole horse thing is that, as a child, you have this fantasy that it's all going to be kind of riding your lovely, I don't know, chestnut Arab mare on the moors and on the beach and cantering around, and it's going to come when you arrive and love you and worship you. And then you kind of get it, and it's all kind of big, hairy cobs and mud and horses not doing what they're told and manure and a lot of darkness and coldness and rain and money and time and those sort of times where you're thinking, why on earth am I doing this? Just why? But I do.
Thank you, Amanda. The question, why on earth am I doing this, I think leads us nicely to our second guest, Alison, and her story. I think we'll hear from Alison's story, and then we'll go deep into unpacking what Amanda has just shared with us all. So, Alison, in addition to your full-time senior lecturing role, you also own a small farm with your husband that, as far as I understand, includes a bunch of sheep, some cats and dogs, and a couple of horses as well. So tell us how that story began.
Thanks, Petty. And I was nodding a lot to Amanda's story because it's very familiar. Yes, you are right. We have a 65-acre small holding down in Devon on the Devon-Cornwall border, and I work full-time, and my husband is a consultant radiologist, so he works full-time as well. And I started adding up the hours. I've never done that before, Amanda, and I just thought I'm just going to stop now. So we, perhaps a little bit like Amanda, I'd got my first horse when I was 11 after a similar kind of pestering parent story, and kept it on livery. And I'd always wanted a farm. I'd always wanted somewhere just to keep my horses. I wasn't particularly expecting to become a farmer. I just wanted somewhere to keep my horses. We were very lucky. We were looking for a new house just after the foot and mouth issues of 18 years ago, and because the land prices were at rock bottom, we managed to sell our little 2-bedroomed house in Winchester with a very small garden and buy our 65-acre farm. The house, it wasn't particularly big at the moment, so we essentially bought the land. Richard, my husband, was in the forces at the time. He was in the Navy and he was in the Gulf, so I moved to the farm with my 2 horses and my 5-month-old baby on my own in February, and the farm had no central heating, at which point I was thinking, why? I looked at our 10-acre field out the back, and just suddenly that realization of what we'd done hit me. So that was quite an interesting one. We started off, when we took the farm over, it was all arable, so it was the farmers that were here before us were growing corn, and we're really friendly with the farmers still. There are surrogate grandparents, and we'd been here. Richard's come back from the Gulf, and we'd been here probably coming up to about 9 or 10 months, and we realised that the problem with 65 acres is the stuff that you're not growing on it needs managing and needs mowing, and my 2 horses at the time could do a bit of a job on that, but weren't coming anywhere near, and you can hardly do 65 acres with a fly mow. So we needed something, and as we didn't know anything about anything, our options were cows, sheep, or pigs. The farm had cows on it previously, but we were a little bit nervous, really following foot and mouth, really. So we decided, had a chat with a local farmer, and came home with a small flock of 6 Dartmoor grey-faced sheep. Dartmoor grey-faced are obviously local to us. We're on the edge of Dartmoor. And they are rare breed sheep, so they're carpet wool sheep, which is why they're rare breed, because we don't have woolly carpets anymore. And they look like little woolly bears. They're very, very cute, actually. We were sort of told by the people that we got the sheep from that obviously we didn't have a dog. Well, we had a spaniel and a cat at the time. So we decided at this point that we didn't particularly want to get another dog. So the people that we got the sheep from said, well, if you train them to come for a bucket of food, you can wander them around without needing the collie. So we sort of really went from there. Sheep followed us around. We had a ram, so sheep then do what sheep and rabbits, etc. do, and our little flock of 6 started to become a little bigger flock and a little bigger flock, and we've really gone from there. And we're lambing at the moment. We've got 1 more ewe to lamb this year, who hopefully isn't doing that at the moment. And well, to give you an idea, this might be quite an interesting one for Sam to pick up, I don't know, but to give you an idea, Richard has been up every night for the last 12 days now, just checking the ewes for lambing. We got up at 6 o'clock this morning, which isn't unusual because we all do a couple of hours before we start any work, and we finished last night at 9 o'clock when it was just starting to get dark, because we did the dams and the horses at the same time. And obviously all our weekends are taken up with doing farm related stuff, not always sheep, to be honest. They don't always take a lot of time. So there we go.
Thank you, Alison. This sounds very interesting in both your cases, because is this about serious leisure or serious labor that you're involved with on an ongoing basis? So before we get into that side of things, my question really is, and you've touched upon this, both of you, a little bit, but I really want to unpack what's the appeal and what's the benefit to you. Can we start with Amanda, please? So you talked about the appeal in terms of in anticipation of the experience buying a horse and looking after the horse, but what's the appeal and benefit of having a horse?
I guess that I love spending time with them, basically, is what it comes down to. So I find it very, I don't say relaxing, but very all-encompassing being with a horse. So when you're with a horse, because they're sensitive to emotions, you need to be able to switch off from all the stuff that's been going off in the day and kind of down-regulate yourself in a way. I'm not good at anything like mindfulness, so I find that very difficult. But if I'm with an animal that weighs, I don't know, getting on for 90 stone, and I'm aware that she's picking up on my stress, that is a good motivation to kind of calm down my breathing and to calm myself down. I just, like, one example was last night after I'd ridden Blossom, I was untacking her, and she does this thing where she loves her ears scratched like a cat. And there's just something lovely about having this huge, great big animal just bend its head towards you one side and then the other side, and then really like demonstrate that it just wants a really, really good scratch. And there's those sort of moments where you feel that you're in communication with her. I think the fact that horses are all different is just, it just makes me smile and laugh, because they all have those different quirks, different personalities, and different ways of showing what they want. I think there's also the thing of mastery, that with riding and horses, there's always something to learn. It's not something that you ever stop learning, and it almost feels like the more you learn, the more there is to learn. And I guess for someone who likes learning, that's quite important. And those odd moments where something goes right and you think, yeah, I've got her working like I want her to go, that's worked, are just so satisfying. So I think there's all of that, really. and just that it kind of takes up a lot of mental energy. I quite like, because I don't have children, I don't have a job that I want to think about outside of work particularly, so it's a sort of thing to focus on. I don't know, that probably sounds really weird, and it's an identity as well, I think, definitely, but I don't know what it is with kind of girls, women and horses. There's just a thing there that you probably can't quite put your finger on as to why it is that horses are so attractive and so all-encompassing. And I don't know, Alison might have more to say about why that is that they can kind of easily take up so much time and money and effort and heartache and still be worth it. Because people who don't get horses don't get that.
Thank you, Amanda. I think that's quite an interesting exposition of an answer you just gave us, and you kind of threw the question back at Alison about the question why, and I also know that Sam would have a lot to unpack in your answer, but let's just move on to Alison and just see Alison, how would you respond to Amanda's question?
Well, I could sit and talk horses to Amanda all day, because like Amanda, they take up our lives. We've got 3. And we're buying another one because obviously you can't have enough horses in your life. So there we go. And they're all very different personalities. And I completely, utterly get the physicality of it. We've got a cobby boy and we've got a full Arab dragon in the yard. And then one in the middle, and it is that caring for them as well, and that responsibility is there for the sheep as well as the horses. It's there for us in everything that we do, and it is that responsibility of that if I don't go and look after those sheep or look after that horse or whatever, nobody else is going to. Well, my daughter will in this case, but if I cajole her with the sheep, not with the horses, but. It is that sometimes I've been talking about this with my husband actually. It's like, why are we doing this? And he sort of looked at me and said, I don't know really. I just, because we enjoy it. And I said, we enjoy it when it's blowing a northeasterly gale and it's sleeting and it's horizontal. But we do enjoy it, and on the why with the sheep, certainly. The sheep have personalities as well. I mean, I think people can maybe understand horses having personalities in the same way that if you've got cats or dogs, your cat or your dog has got a personality. The horse definitely have personalities. But I don't think I was particularly prepared for the sheep having personalities when we got sheep. I thought they'd just be sheep, really. And they do. And what's so lovely about the ewes and certainly with the lambs at the moment is that the lambs will play, and so when it gets to sort of early evening, the lambs will start to just run around the field and play with each other. So the ewes will be eating and they'll just go on like a little bunch of kids and they'll jump onto anything, whether at the moment it's a log that's out there, but it's been upturned feed troughs and stuff before, and one will jump on, and it's almost like they're playing I'm the King of the Castle. The one will jump on and jump off, and then another one will jump on and jump off, and they are quite clearly playing. And there was a lovely moment. We had one lamb early this year because we're still learning, as Amanda said. I don't think you ever stop, and despite the fact we've been doing this for 18 years now, we're not very good farmers. We try, but we had one lamb early. So he hasn't had any friends to play with. He's quite big now. And we put him in with the other lambs and he was playing with them. And it was so sweet because I've not seen him properly play before. And that was really, really nice to see. So, yeah, the lambs are very cute. The other thing they do, which I think surprises people, is they stand on top of the ewes. So if the ewes are lying down, well, they sort of sit down a bit like a cat does or a dog does, they sort of sit sphinx-like. And the lambs will jump onto their backs, mainly if it's cold. they'll go on for warmth. And the ewes also look after each other, so you'll get one ewe who'll be looking after sort of 3 or 4 lambs, because especially some of the younger ones just wander off. So they leave it with Granny, and Granny looks after them. So every year I think, why are we lambing? But then when we do lamb, it's worth it. It's worth the 6 o'clock in the morning than getting up at midnight to make sure they're okay. So I think that's why we do it.
Thank you, Alison. It's always an interesting conversation when we're passionate about something and you sit down and say, why am I doing this? I never actually thought about it. It just feels right. But to actually name how and why it feels right, it can be difficult. Talking about naming things, I know Sam has a lot to unpack in the 2 stories we've heard thus far. And I wonder what Sam thinks of this for these 2 examples, and how and if they fit with the serious leisure pursuit, given the nature of what we're discussing today. Sam?
Yeah, you might have noticed I've been frantically writing some notes down here. It's really, really interesting. There's not, from what I can draw out of my kind of awareness of the serious leisure perspective, a great deal written on this in terms of a kind of a designated area of serious leisure. But in terms of trying to make some sense of this, if you like, as a core activity, or the different, because obviously both examples are quite different, although livestock are at the centre, and I think you both mentioned, the caring and responsibility aspect is something that's very strong, and that certainly comes through in how you're talking. But actually, in terms of both of the examples, they are quite different in the sense that, so for Amanda and Alison, if we're talking about serious leisure, there's typically 3 types. So we've got the amateur leisure pursuits, which typically have professional counterparts, but we're, as amateurs, we're not working in that professional capacity. Hobbyists who tend to be activity participants, but with no kind of amateur equivalence to say. And then you've got the volunteers. So volunteer, the altruistic nature of volunteering. There is another one which I'll get to, because I think that's where one of these sits. But I would certainly think, in terms of Amanda, it certainly strikes me as a hobbyist activity. It's a hobby in the sense that, I know there are competitive elements to horse riding, but that, from the narrative you've told me, that's not part of why you do what you do. Is that true? Or is there an element of that?
I guess I'm very aware when I'm riding that a lot of people at the yard where I ride are serious competitors and compete for Wales or, at a national level. I have competed at a much lower level with my previous horse, and I partly bought Blossom, my current horse, because she's sort of been trained to do dressage, and she's a potential competition horse. Obviously, in the middle of a pandemic, that's been really on the back burner.
Yeah.
So although I'd never see myself as a professional competitor in any way, shape or form, the competing is definitely part of what I want to do. Okay. And there is that, I guess, sometimes really uncomfortable comparison when I ride alongside riders who are professionals, or much more professional than me, and competing at a high level, that there's that comparison of, yes, I'm just the hobbyist with my big hairy cob, and they've got their lovely competition horses, although mine's lovely as well. But that can be quite an uncomfortable place, I think. Does that make sense?
No, I do, in terms of that social context that you operate in terms of the yard, so to speak. Kat, do you want to come in there?
I was just going to say that I think we encounter this interesting difficulty that with serious leisure, with the serious leisure perspective, because Amanda, I really noted that you said you've described that situation as uncomfortable, and you've just talked about yourself as just a hobbyist. You're basically kind of diminishing what it is. And I think this is the challenge, because we can think somehow that if what we're doing isn't the same as what a professional is doing or whatever, that somehow, it's lacking in some way, or it's falling short of whatever that might be. Which actually, if we think about it, if we're thinking about somebody else and what they were doing, like, for example, I'm listening to what you're describing and what you've achieved with Blossom and your passion for horses, and it's not even in my mind. They're like, well, can't believe you just, ride her around and you're not a professional. Right? That's not even on my radar, because what you're doing is so fascinating and meaningful for you, and the meaning making that you're doing comes across as you speak. But I think a challenge we all have for our own leisure pursuits can be that we diminish them and we reduce them in some way, or we put ourselves in this uncomfortable space you described, because we're not as good as, I don't know, even the idea of not as good as, what's the point of this? I say this as in my own experience as well. Just wanted to mention that I definitely don't see anything that you've described as only this or not as much as that. No, I think we have to try and be kinder to ourselves, don't we?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting there, Kat, absolutely. I think, it's that kind of the default state with many leisure activities. It's othering, the othering nature of leisure. It's other than, work or whatever else, and professional counterparts. What I was getting at, Amanda, was obviously, you keep the horse in a stable. That stable's part of a broader kind of context, and there's clearly a racing or competitive nature to the yard. So that counterpoint for you, that comparison is always there, or in a way. But certainly in the way that you've described the nature of your pursuit and why you do what you do, and obviously clearly so passionate about it. You've talked about mastery, although it's not mastery necessarily in a competitive element. It's mastery of just being able to ride an animal in a certain way, and there's certain techniques and everything else. But also you start thinking about some of the benefits that you glean from that. You talked about the clear, obviously animal therapy is huge. That started to happen just before pandemic for our own institution, where we used to have different animals come onto campus, for example. So we recognise this as being beneficial to our well-being. But what I really liked about what you were saying there was around your identity, the attachment you have to the core activity of, caring for and having responsibility for the horse, but also what that then means for your own identity work as well. So, and how, I kind of want to be able to go and do that competitive thing, but on my own terms, which makes it kind of a, it still very much sits within, for me, it sits within the hobbyist kind of realm of serious leisure, but kind of maybe a hobbyist sport. And a previous podcast, we talked about fly fishing. And it's a similar kind of thing there. And there's specializations, and you could do dressage and a number of different activities within that. But so I certainly see that. But it's fundamentally hobbyist activity born out of that, that self-interest. It's nothing for anybody else. It's just about me. This is what this means to me. This is what it's all about. Now, on the flip side, because I'm wary of time, you went on for, I've got about 14 pages of notes, so we haven't got that kind of time. But so in many ways, Alison, your narrative's similar, in terms of, that self-interest and some of the benefits that you glean out of what you do. And obviously still come to grips with why you do what you do, I think, clearly. But that's a journey, isn't it? And this idea of we find a career in our serious leisure pursuits. You can certainly see those, the stages of career with Amanda in terms of, early participation would have been, very much as a neophyte learner, and now, you've kept a number of horses. You may be more towards kind of the expert end of that, the continuum. What we have in the serious leisure perspective that I think fits with what Alison was saying is this the idea of devotee work, which is where, because clearly what tipped it for me was, you've bought this, you say small holding, 60 plus acres is not a small holding. I don't care what anybody says. For me, that's the entire Chester-le-Street town. So yeah, it's a big old space, but it's still got to pay for itself. So there's an element of income generation there. But when we talk about devotee work, we're still talking about that self-interest and a strong positive attachment to the core activity of looking after animals and looking after the land. But essentially, it's serious leisure that's found in gainful employment. So you just happen to be making a living, or a part of a living at least, in order to keep doing what you're doing. So it's a kind of a self-fulfilling process. So if I was to position, Alison, your narrative, it would be this idea of devotee work, because there is a work component to it. You found, but it's you do it in the explanation of why you do what you do. It wasn't to earn the money. It was to be in nature. It was to be in this space with these animals doing this work. You just happen to be making some money to enable you to keep doing that. So, that's my very coarse attempt at positioning the different narratives. There's so much in there. I particularly like you both mentioned attachment, but in different ways. So attachment to core activity. So when we talk about serious leisure, there's a core activity to just about all serious leisure. At the core, it's about this, and Amanda, it's about being with your horse in that. But then there's also place attachment. So you both have to go, or if you're Alison, you live at that place. But and Amanda, I guess you could argue you pretty much live there as well. But there is an attachment to a place as well, which importantly is other than other places, i.e. of work and everything else. So I wonder, a question then to relay back to both of you, and Amanda, if I could come to you first, in terms of that attachment and that place, what is it about that really really draws you in?
It's interesting because I tried a lot of different stables before I live in Bristol and I ride in South Wales, and people often ask me why I choose to live 30 miles away from where I keep my horse. And a lot of it is to do with that particular yard, the people who are there, the fact that although there's actually some very, very accomplished people there, I don't ever feel judged by anyone else. I feel deeply judged by myself, but I feel nothing but positivity from other people. And I think that can be quite unusual in the horse world, which can be quite a judgy world. It can be a world where people are maybe very good with animals, but not good with people, to put it mildly. So I feel very safe there. I feel very able to ask questions as comparatively a new person to this world. Although I've been in it all my life, I'm still considered new. I feel it's a place that, I just feel very at home. And during the first lockdown, when I was didn't have access to it, that was incredibly hard, because it's my place where I get out the car and I instantly feel, I'm home almost. I guess I've been going there for 7 years, so I've built up fairly deep relationships to people, to the stable cat, to other horses that aren't actually my horse. And it's a place where work or my day job doesn't exist to a large extent, as well. And I just love the smells, the sights, the fact there's bats flitting around, there's swallows, there's that, I live in the middle of Bristol. I don't have that seasonality in my day-to-day life, but I have that when I go to the stable. I also like that it's a world that includes the weather. It includes those northeasterly gales. It includes hard physical labour, which again I don't get in my day-to-day job. So, and I wouldn't keep my horse anywhere else. And that can feel quite difficult, because there's that question of, do I keep her there because it's best for me or because it's best for her?
That is a wonderful question. I mean, are you asking yourself that question, or is that?
I sold my previous horse because it was the wrong place to keep her. So I sold her back to a home that was more suitable for her, because the stables that worked for me wasn't working for her. Yeah,
that's really interesting, because I'm hearing that there's clearly a unique kind of social world to that stable, which then gives you what you need, or at least you've developed a relationship to that space and that social world that has allowed you to glean those benefits. But you've got somebody else to think about as well, and that's really, really interesting. Kat, do you want to come in there?
Yes, that was exactly what I was just going to comment on, actually, that this for me is the most striking difference in terms of the focus of this podcast episode from what we've looked at before, because the activities you're describing feature the subject of your leisure is a personality or personalities, who have got their own ideas and ways of being, right? Which I think completely changes what the experience is. I was struck firstly, Amanda, by your description of you going to the stable, and you touched on identity. And it seemed to me almost as if actually that part of you that connects with your horse transcends any of your other identities, and in a way has almost taken on feels like your true identity when you're talking, if you don't mind me putting it that way, you know, which is really interesting, because we think of leisure as like a tack on, right? Or as a side plate to the main order of what we're meant to be doing. But actually the way you've described it, in a way, your leisure activity feels like who you truly are. And the other things you have to do is the side plate, like putting up with living in a city and stuff like that, you know, which is really interesting and a very different framing. And I think for me, I feel as if the presence of these personalities of your horse and Alison, all the animals you've described with your sheep and your horses and your dogs and cats, brings a different level of emotional investment, because there's these central relationships at the heart of what's happening. And I think often in our previous discussions about serious leisure, when we talk about the important relationships, are often about our peers, you know, with someone we're going fly fishing with, or someone I'm making music with, or something like that. But interestingly, in this context, the significant relationship is with the subject of the leisure activity. Who is also not a human, you know? And so you've got the responsibility, you have to do this caring aspect. And I just find this very interesting, because in a way that leisure will hold its space. And like many of us have had to surrender different leisure activities because of COVID. You know, we haven't been able to see people. I can't make music. I can't go and do my choirs and stuff. I just can't. But you have these individuals who are dependent. So you set your life up around to make that possible. But then you've both talked about the fact that you have to go and care for them anyway. And so in a way, it kind of secures that leisure in your life. Like no one's going to take that from you, are they? Because those animals need you. And so you'll be there for them. I just found this very interesting and a very different emphasis from this kind of take it or leave it thing. It is usually the case with leisure, and often many of us might leave it, you know, because we let it get squeezed out. But yours is well fenced in because it's owned by living creatures, you know. So actually, I was leading to a question about this, sorry, after my monologue, which was I actually wanted to ask Amanda whether that description of identity, and for you, Alison, as well, does that resonate with you, that sense of a sort of a primary identity, a sort of salient identity, which is more about this contact with your horse, with your animals and where you live? Or perhaps maybe you'd like to clarify that for me and explain it better from inside.
For me, absolutely, it's my identity. And yeah, I mean, I think probably most of my friends probably wish it wasn't quite such a big part of my identity, because they're probably not that interested in my horse. And my partner, you know, it takes up a huge amount of time. I think possibly because I haven't maybe had such a defined career path as some people, so I don't have that sense of, yes, I'm an expert in this, or I have this real mastery over a particular subject, like I don't know, possibly Alison does. So there's that sense of, yeah, my job pays the wages. I find it very interesting. I enjoy it, but I don't identify as a student caseworker. That's not how I think of myself. Identify myself as someone who has a horse, primarily. And that is how I see my identity. And that feels like an identity that I've had since I was a child. Even though I didn't have a horse, I kind of identified that I should have had one, if that makes sense.
Alison, would you like to comment on that for me?
Yeah, I completely understand that, and it's interesting, as we've been talking, I'm also looking at my family members as well, because obviously we're all in this together, and seeing different identities. I completely get the identity with the horses. I think my identity with horses has been going on since I was a child as well. So I see that identity with my 16-year-old. My 16-year-old is the horse one, and her identity is absolutely around those horses. We do have competition horses, but we've kind of grown with them, if that makes sense. And they are seen as, each one of them is a team. So Team Hurry is Martha and Hurry, And he is a very, very different team to Team Mac, who's the grouchy dragon one, who's a very different team to Team Bob, who is Martha and Bob, who's the copy one. And I think maybe that gives you an idea of that difference. We don't particularly have Team Sheep. They are different. I don't have team number 7 or team number 8 because they're numbered, so we know which years go with which lambs. But they do have names. Quite often we name a lot of them, and you can tell them apart. But just thinking about the identity, yeah, I think have an identity as a smallholder. We're not farmers because we don't have the big farms, the 300-acre pluses. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So I think you said earlier on about, there's nothing small about 65 acres. It's basically too small to make any money and too big to not do something with. That's the problem with it. But I think what's quite interesting is I had horses on livery for a long time before we moved to the farm. And when we got here, I suddenly realised that there were big gaps in my knowledge to actually know what I was doing. And what I find now is the blurring. I used to keep my horse an hour and a half away from where I used to live. I used to live in Winchestershire. I kept her at West Wales. But now it's a blurring because I don't have anywhere to get away from. I don't have a livery yard to go to. It's lovely. It's the same with the sheep. I don't have somewhere to go to see them. They're here. I mean, literally in the house if I don't shut the door if they happen to be out in the garden. And while that is absolutely lovely, it's also a draw. And sometimes it's a little bit like having kids. If, for example, we're in the middle of this, if the sheep get out or the horses get out, then if I'm teaching, I have to go and do something about it because it's an animal. It's so that blurring is quite interesting. The identity, I don't know whether it's just worth saying that my husband is, as I say, consultant radiologist. I think he sees himself far more as a farmer than he does a doctor, because I think that's where he loves being a doctor, but he's happiest when he's messing about on the farm.
Thank you, Alison. Well, everything has been so fascinating to listen to, but I think in your last comment, you alluded to some of the difficulties in all of this, because as Amanda told us earlier, nothing is quite as you imagined it, or you imagined it as a little girl having a pony. We have about 5 minutes left, and I really want to talk about the nitty-gritty of all this in the 5 minutes. The difficulty that exists in both your pursuits and the difficulty that you ignore and pursue on regardless. So, Alison, you already touched upon some of that in terms of the lack of separation, and sometimes becomes too much juggling both at the same time. I wonder what the difficulties are for Amanda.
I think for me, a lot of the difficulty is around guilt and the balance of my life and my horse life. I keep my horse at a livery stable, so I have days when I pay someone else to care for her, basically, which I end up feeling quite guilty about. But then I also feel quite guilty when I'm at the stable and I'm ignoring my partner. So there's this huge demand of the horse and the guilt of not always being able to meet her needs, even though I know she doesn't really care who meets her needs. I think there is that sense that actually, I guess a lot of being with a horse is hard work, and I don't really see that as a difficulty. I think the tiredness can be hard. Like, I got home, 10:15 last night, and that's regular throughout the week. Not every day, but it's common. I think the sort of weariness you get sometimes when you find that you need to do the hay nets and you have to go and find a Stanley knife and open a bale of hay in the freezing cold and the pouring rain, and it's really late and the horse has started kicking the stable door, and you just feel absolutely exhausted because you've already worked a full day. I think that can be difficult. I think for me, the self-comparison and the feeling I haven't got as good mastery as I want is really difficult, and that's probably the hardest. I think the other thing that's really hard is that a horse can go fantastically one day or 1 minute, and then it can just act like it's not been ridden before, or act like it's about to die, or it's just like, and that can be so infuriating. And particularly my old horse, she used to leave staff members who rode her in tears because she could just be so stubborn and so contrary, and that leaves you feeling awful about yourself because you're thinking, I can't do this, and it takes all my time and money and I can't do it. And I think for me that's the hardest bit. I don't, at the end of the day, mind the gales and the horse poo and that stuff. It's that sense of when that relationship isn't going well is the really hard thing. That's the hardest thing is for me, and I think I haven't been there yet, but if I had a horse and it was the end of its life, that would be very hard. When an animal's ill, that's hard. When I had to sell my previous horse because what I could provide wasn't what she needed, that was really hard. So I think those for me are the really difficult things. And I can spend far more time worrying about my horse than I do about work. That's the difficulty for me. So it's the flip side of this lovely relationship, is that it's also can be a really tricky relationship.
Alison, did you want to comment on that just quickly?
Yeah, I will try and steer away from the horse stuff, but I was nodding to everything Amanda was saying, and sometimes certainly my younger daughter will come in and say, oh, if you'd just meet me a quarter of the way, that would be so nice. So yeah, if you think about train a dog and multiply it a lot, I think. So with us, with the sheep and the farm in general, really, it is physical. It is being out in the cold and the wet and looking for, the Stanley knife to do whatever it is you're doing, trying to get to the feeds, trying to it's ice on the buckets, which is the key thing. I remember posting a picture of one of those lovely chilly mornings in February on our group. We have a group chat in our team at work, and I knew what happened. Everyone's going, oh, isn't it lovely? Isn't it amazing? I was utterly freezing. My hands were frozen, my feet were freezing, and I was standing on buckets, water troughs, trying to break the ice for the sheep. The horses were fine because their stuff's insulated. But the sheep troughs are out in the middle of the field, and then looking for something to try and break the ice with, thinking, oh, why? But it was a beautiful morning, and I wouldn't have gone out in that morning if I hadn't have had to go around and break the ice on the sheep buckets. So with the sheep, it is cold. It is difficult when we lose one. We didn't do too badly this year, but we lost a couple of lambs, and it's heartbreaking when that happens. So if you have livestock, you have dead stock, and it is awful, and you have to be prepared for that, I think. But those are the key things. The sheep are pretty good.
Okay, wonderful. No, so just bringing all that together. I mean, this more so, I think, than any previous podcast. I mean, I don't know if Petya and Kat will agree with me here, but you've been talking about how hard it is in terms of, and we use the word labour, but actually what I'm hearing here is this idea of emotional labour, which is really front and centre. There's an emotional labour to this, the core activities of both of your narratives, and I think more so than perhaps any other podcast we've done so far. I think that's very much down to the nature of the activities. But through that emotional labour, and because of that emotional labour, we get there's a commitment there to keep going, to persevere, even because of those challenges, even because of the weather, or because the horse isn't behaving itself, or whatever. That perseverance is there, but also that to improve, to do better, to be better, whether that be mastery in terms of riding the horse, or to manage the farm better, to receive better rewards back from the land, so to speak. So I think as an overarching kind of summary comment from me, that idea of emotional labour has really come through quite profoundly for me. I can see you both nodding there for everybody's benefit. I think there's a clear sense that that's central to both of those narratives. But it's been really, really interesting. I think so different to what we've had up till this point. and yet, and completely unashamedly so, in terms of clear commitment to, well, you know, I actually identify as this first as opposed to anything else. And I think that's a healthy alternative interpretation as well. So really, 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 really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing your stories.
Thank you, Sam, for your commentary. This has been a fascinating podcast. We have come to an end. We can clearly talk about this for hours and hours more. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our contributors today, our guests, Amanda Headley-White and Alison Miles, and to thank Sam for his Elkington for his expertise, and to thank Hat Branch for her questions and insights that she brought to this conversation. And to thank for Helga Gannestodir, who's patiently waited doing the recording today, and who's also helping with our edits. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening. And until our next episode, when we talk about how we take our leisure seriously. Goodbye, everyone.